Hello friends, Paper Historian here. I'm glad to welcome you to my channel, where we don't just tell stories, we follow them into the smoky corners of history where rumour and fear held more weight than reason. Tonight, we step into the Middle Ages, into villages where cows stop giving milk and neighbours whisper that someone has cursed them, and into courtrooms where judges decide the only way to find the truth is to put the accused on the rack. The witch is not yet the cackling crone of fairy tales, but the woman with herbs by the fire, the neighbour too different, too unlucky, or simply too alone. And the witch hunter is not the cartoon villain, but the magistrate, the preacher, the man with a seal in one hand and scripture in the other, convinced that he is preserving order while he sets communities on fire. Over 6 centuries, the suspicion grows from kitchen gossip to cosmic conspiracy, until Europe fills its skies with sermons and its fields with pyres. So settle in, because tonight we're not just telling the tale of witches, we're tracing how entire societies became their own hunters. He sees her long before anyone calls her a witch. She is the woman at the edge of the village who knows where the wild thyme hides in the ditch and how to calm a colicky child when sleep refuses the house. People knock on her door in the small hours because the cow has gone dry, or because the bread will not rise, or because grief has taken the measure of a family and left it breathless. She answers with a pot and a whisper, measures leaves in a palm that smells of smoke, and sends them home with a prayer added for safety, the sign of the cross, a hedge as useful as any fence. The same neighbours who bless her skill today will, in a winter not far off, shake their heads at milk souring in a pail and say she knows too much. Between gratitude and suspicion, there is only the width of a season, and Europe is preparing to walk that narrow path. In the early and high Middle Ages, her shadow is not yet monstrous. Churchmen who write about night flights and spirit processions tend to call them illusions rather than roads. The Canon Episcopi, copied into canonical collections by the 10th and 11th centuries, warns bishops that women who say they ride with Diana or Herodias at night are deceived by the devil. What they claim happens in the body happens only in the mind. The correction is pastoral and skeptical. Priests are instructed to refute superstition, to bring such women to confession and penance, and to teach their flocks that dreams are not deeds. The learned world is content to let village notions be village notions, provided they do not harden into heresy. The village sees the matter otherwise. In a hamlet where one hailstorm can ruin a year and one sick cow can starve a family, causation is not a philosophical luxury. It is a map of blame and hope. The same gestures, herb, charm, prayer, that soothe a fever in summer will be suspected of drying a mother's milk in winter. In England, men call the healers cunning folk. In the German lands, they have a dozen names for the midwife who knows too many recipes. They are tolerated and used while luck holds. When luck fails, accusation has a face and a door. By the 14th century, learned and popular worlds begin to edge nearer, and not in ways that comfort anyone. The scholastic revival has filled Europe with jurists and theologians who love clean distinctions. The devil in their manuals is no longer just the author of vague temptations. He is a strategist with agents. Harm caused by incantation, maleficium, ceases to be merely a social nuisance and takes on the colour of sin. Two ideas meet on the page and change each other's weight: the village complaint of practical damage and the theologian's fear of apostasy. A dead calf, a withered field, a sickly child, these had always been occasions for muttered blame. Now, in a magistrate's room or a bishop's chamber, they can become signs that someone has not only harmed a neighbour, but also broken faith with God. The machinery that will give this fear teeth is procedural rather than mythical. Roman canonical procedure, revived in ecclesiastical and secular courts, makes confession the queen of proofs. Judges who believe themselves responsible for arriving at the truth, even when witnesses sleep or lie, are permitted, under certain conditions, to question the accused until his testimony moves. Half-proof, rumour sifted through sworn testimony, the logic of probability, all this authorises pressure in the name of certainty. It is not yet the age of printed demonological treatises or specialist witch-finders. The man with the questions is still a priest trained in canon law or a town officer who has read a few manuals and learned to be suspicious of patterns. He is more notary and pastor than he is inquisitor, as people later imagine the term. But he has a problem that no scholastic distinction can solve for him. How to prove the invisible? He solves it by tethering the invisible to the visible. He asks who quarrelled with whom the day before the storm that flattened the rye. He asks who refused to lend milk to the neighbour whose child then starved. He notes the woman who muttered while looking at the cow that miscarried, the girl who used a charm to win a lover and whose rival's hair fell out that month. He makes a map of grievances and calls it evidence. When that map seems to show a pattern that prayer and fines cannot erase, he reaches, reluctantly at first, for the power to compel an answer. When pain loosens a tongue, the story that comes out always resembles stories already on the edge of the village. Hares that are women in the morning, men visited in their sleep, sick children healed by a borrowed shirt. The judge writes, then rereads, and discovers a narrative he half expected. So far, there is no Sabbath on a mountain with the Prince of Hell enthroned and dancing. So far, there is no signed pact in blood, no systematic handbook for hunting a species of enemy. So far, the witch is still primarily a neighbour whose malice or envy explains bad luck, and whose ritual vocabulary, herbs, knots, words, comes from the same shelves as the healers. But symbol is changing. A broken plough is no longer just a farmer's expense. It can become, in the mind of a magistrate attuned to demons, the footprint of a larger rebellion. What was local harm swells to the size of rebellion against the cosmic judge. The church moves more cautiously than popular imagination later grants it. In the 13th century, inquisitors are mostly occupied with organized dissent, Cathars and Waldensians, later conversos suspected of Judaizing in Spain. Superstition remains a pastoral problem more than a capital one. But preachers learn quickly that the devil's power makes for compelling sermons, and friars who roam the countryside to preach reform find an audience delighted to hear of spirits and snares. They begin to borrow, amplifying village motifs with scholastic certainty and sending those embellished stories back into the parishes as warnings. The feedback loop is born, from pulpit to hearth and back again. Meanwhile, the world is coming apart often enough to make any explanation seem plausible. The Black Death halves villages and undoes trust. The Little Ice Age brings failed harvests and freak storms. War moves across frontiers that once felt like walls. When the same winter brings a frozen river, a dead baby, and 2 cows that refuse to stand, the line between misfortune and malice vanishes. Accusation becomes a way to pretend that randomness has rules. In such years, the healer's hut is too dangerous a silhouette to leave undisturbed. What of the hunter, the figure who later stands in Prince with a rope and a Bible? In the late Middle Ages, he is not yet a profession. He is a travelling judge with a box of documents, or a Dominican delegated by a bishop, or a secular bailiff whose job is to keep the town from tearing itself apart. In one district, he arrives and calms the people, quotes the old Canon Episcopi, says that night flights are dreams and that God is not mocked by illusions. In another, he decides the whispers form a net and throws it. He is variable because the law is still local, the church still more union than monarchy. He is as likely to be a skeptic as a zealot, and much depends on whether he is tired when he arrives. The printing press is not yet singing, but minstrels, merchants and pilgrims already do the work that pamphlets will later finish. Tales migrate with people who sell salt and cloth. A story told in a Breton inn arrives a year later on a Tyrolean bench, fatter with details and stronger with moral. By the time the 15th century ends, those stories will have coalesced into an image that can be printed and pasted on walls. the witch as conscious servant of the devil, the Sabbath as anti-mass, the pact as legal deed. That printed image will convince magistrates who never met a healer that they are fighting a conspiracy. For now, in the long 14th century, the ingredients are on the table and a few local cooks are stirring the pot. He rides away one afternoon from a village where he has been called to examine 3 complaints and a rumour. He leaves behind a penitent, a marriage mended, a warning to stop using charms at baptisms. In another village, under another sky, a different official leaves behind a rope and a memory that will be told to children as warning and as proof that the world has rules. The difference is not the devil, it is the man with the pen and the people at the door. Witchcraft in late medieval Europe is not yet the theatre of bonfires that later centuries will direct. It is a conversation, often heated, between hearth and tribunal about how to apportion fear. It is the slow legal discovery that harm can hide in gestures that look like help. It is the theological decision that such harm, if it exists, is treason against God. It is the village's habit of blaming the face everyone knows. It is a house that dries herbs in the wind and, one winter too many, finds that the wind has changed. When the press begins to sing and the Reformations divide Europe into camps that read the same Bible against each other, the conversation will turn into a hunt. Manuals will appear that tell judges what patterns to see and what words to squeeze until they drip confession. Men will make careers out of fear and call them zeal. For now, the witch is a neighbour whose work runs on the same calendar as everyone else's, and the hunter is a clerk who writes fear into Latin, and between them lies a world that is deciding whether bad luck is a sin. If he's careful, the judge keeps it there, in gossip and fines and the soft law of pastoral correction. If he is eager, he makes a spectacle. The Middle Ages end not with the invention of witches, but with the invention of the witch as symbol. The woman at the edge of the village is not new. The decision to see her as part of a plot is. He does not yet carry the title witch hunter when he first steps into the square with parchment in one hand and a crucifix in the other. In the late Middle Ages and the opening of the early modern world, the men who will become symbols of the hunt are not freelance zealots, but officials. They are Dominican inquisitors sent by bishops or secular magistrates appointed by town councils, or itinerant jurists whose authority rests on a seal pressed in wax. Their power is procedural, not magical, and their skill lies in turning whispers into testimony and testimony into confessions. But with every village visit, with every sermon that ties storms to sorcery and illness to pacts, they begin to acquire an identity of their own, hunters of an enemy defined by imagination as much as by evidence. The 16th century opens the floodgates. Printing multiplies voices that had once circulated only in manuscript. Suddenly, a treatise written by 2 German friars, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, can be read from the Baltic to the Alps. The Malleus Maleficarum, the hammer of witches, does not invent witchcraft, but it gives shape and procedure to what had been scattered fears. It tells magistrates what to look for, what questions to ask, and what answers to expect. It tells them that women are more credulous and more carnal, that the devil's power is real, that the pact is binding, that torture is justified if truth hides behind silence. With every copy sold, the text arms another provincial court with a manual of suspicion. In the German lands, fragmented by princes and free cities, competition for godliness fuels zeal. A small principality, anxious to display its piety and its control, is more willing to permit a local official to stage a purge than a larger kingdom that worries about political stability. Here professional witch hunters appear. Some are jurists who wander from town to town, offering expertise in detecting witches. Others are clergymen whose sermons inflame congregations, then present themselves as indispensable guides to purgation. Their reputations spread with the same swiftness as the rumours they claim to quell. A magistrate who doubts his own ability to handle accusations hires such a man, pays him from town coffers, and watches the machinery unfold. The methods are procedural theatre. Accusations are collected, sometimes from quarrels that have simmered for years. Women are examined for witches' marks, blemishes that can be interpreted as the devil's brand. A suspect is subjected to questioning under duress, her silences written down as proof of stubborn guilt. Confessions, once wrung out, are amplified with names of accomplices, and the circle widens. The witch hunter becomes indispensable not because he finds witches where none exist, but because he provides a framework in which suspicion can endlessly reproduce itself. Sermons bolster the trials. A preacher mounts a pulpit and explains that the weather is broken because witches have flown through the night, that cattle die because witches milk them invisibly, that stillbirths and famines are the fruit of diabolical conspiracies. His words give theological legitimacy to grievances that might otherwise be dismissed as neighbourly quarrels. The community, already anxious in times of plague or war, nods and believes, and when the preacher steps down, the magistrate steps up. Fear becomes policy. Some hunters are remembered by name. In Bamberg, in Würzburg, in the Swiss cantons, officials orchestrate mass trials where hundreds die. Their signatures remain in archives, their neat Latin recording confessions extracted by the rack. They are not wild-eyed fanatics in appearance, but bureaucrats, keeping accounts of how much wood was used for pyres and how many florins were spent on scribes. The very banality of their work terrifies later centuries. Yet not all courts follow their lead. Skeptical voices persist. In some places, judges demand stricter evidence, refuse to convict without tangible harm, or limit torture. In France, in the Parlement of Paris, higher courts overturn village convictions with weary irritation at the credulity of local tribunals. In England, where the common law resists continental procedures, torture is rare and trials produce fewer executions, though fear still flares. The figure of the witch hunter is not universal. He flourishes in pockets where politics, theology, and local rivalry combine into combustible fuel. By the 17th century, the image hardens. The witch hunter is caricatured by his enemies as a zealot who sees Satan behind every storm cloud and midwife. By his supporters, he is praised as a soldier of Christ, defending the weak from invisible armies. He himself likely sees only a duty to record, to interrogate, to shepherd a community through the drama of fear. But because he profits, whether in fees, prestige, or the satisfaction of authority, he becomes a lightning rod. The witch trials are no longer merely trials. They are hunts, and the men who lead them wear the name whether they want it or not. When famine subsides, when wars end, when intellectual currents shift towards skepticism and rationality, the hunters begin to look foolish even to their peers. Some die in obscurity, others recant or soften their stance. But the title clings in history, and the silhouette of the witch hunter, Bible in one hand, warrant in the other, and an eager crowd at his back, becomes one of the defining images of early modern Europe. The irony is sharp. The witch hunters thought themselves guardians of order, but they preserved for posterity the picture of disorder. They thought they were stamping out superstition, but they ensured that their own names lived on as symbols of credulity. And while the women and men they condemned vanished into ash, their own titles echo: hunters of witches, prey of history. The witch hunter may have carried the warrant, but the first sparks rarely came from his quill. They rose instead from the conversations whispered in kitchens, in church porches, in the furrows between fields. A society always on the brink of hunger and disease needed explanations, and it found them in the faces of those already marked as different. The real machinery of persecution was communal long before it became judicial, and the records of the 16th and 17th centuries read less like chronicles of theology than like the minutes of village quarrels elevated to cosmic scale. Every community had its web of resentments. The woman who begged too often for bread, the widow who muttered curses when turned away, the old midwife whose remedies smelled more of pagan charm than priestly blessing, the foreigner who spoke with an accent in a village that prized sameness. Each lived one mistake away from accusation. When a storm flattened crops or a child wasted away, people remembered every odd glance, every quarrel, every unexplained misfortune. These fragments were stitched together into a tapestry of guilt. The process was so natural that villagers often described it not as a choice, but as an unveiling. The signs had always been there, and now they were clear. The testimony collected in court records is full of these small narratives. A cow sickened after a neighbour refused milk to a poor woman. A child cried incessantly after being scolded by an old midwife. A man who declined to sell firewood cheaply found his roof struck by lightning weeks later. The sequence of cause and effect was unprovable, but to the villagers it made sense because it restored order. Misfortune was not random, but inflicted, and if it was inflicted, it could be punished. Rumour was the bloodstream of this process. It moved faster than priests could preach or magistrates could ride. A story told at a hearth in one hamlet was retold at market in the next town and returned embroidered with new details. Soon, the alleged witch was accused not only of souring milk, but of flying at night or feasting with demons. The communal imagination inflated local grievances into cosmic narratives. In some regions, children claimed they had been taken to Sabbaths, echoing details from sermons they had overheard. In others, shepherds swore they saw figures riding through storm clouds, linking every clap of thunder to witchcraft. Communities often pressed reluctant officials into action. A judge who hesitated to prosecute might be accused himself of weakness or complicity. Councils in small towns were swayed by crowds demanding justice for calamities. Once panic had taken hold, officials discovered that inaction threatened civic peace as much as credulity. Better to stage a trial and execution than to leave fear simmering into riot. Thus, the witch hunter, whether clerical or secular, often followed rather than led the pack. Accusations spread through contagion. One confession under torture named neighbours, who then named others, until a handful of quarrels turned into dozens of prosecutions. The great panics of Würzburg and Bamberg, where hundreds were executed in the 1620s, began with only a few complaints. The social dynamic is clear. In small communities, naming someone else was a way to survive, or at least to postpone doom. Networks of suspicion widened until they threatened everyone, including the elite who had authorized the process. Only when panic touched the families of magistrates did the frenzy subside. The economic and gendered patterns of accusation are equally striking. Many accused were women on the margins, widows without male protectors, healers whose remedies challenged physicians, beggars whose need made them inconvenient. But men too fell into the net, especially when property disputes or political rivalries sharpened. In alpine valleys, prosperous farmers accused competitors. In towns, guild rivalries erupted into witchcraft trials disguised as piety. Witchcraft was the language through which communities litigated grievances they could not otherwise resolve. Festivals and sermons fueled the atmosphere. During Lent or after harvest, when crowds gathered and preachers thundered about sin, accusations often spiked. A fiery homily linking drought to witches could turn private suspicion into public demand. Children repeated what they heard, women gossiped as they kneaded bread, men muttered in taverns over ale. Soon the atmosphere was so charged that any unusual event, a stillbirth, a hailstorm, a sudden death, ignited accusations like tinder. Once the machinery started, it was difficult to stop because trials themselves produced new evidence. Confessions extracted under duress were taken as fact. Those confessions named accomplices, which justified more arrests, which produced more confessions. The cycle could continue until whole villages were hollowed. Records from Lorraine and the Swiss cantons describe communities where hardly a family escaped suspicion, and where fear of accusation was as potent as fear of witches. Yet the same communities that drove hunts also ended them. When executions became too numerous, when respectable citizens were swept into the net, or when skeptics within councils refused to sanction more burnings, the panic collapsed. Villagers who once clamoured for trials now muttered uneasily about injustice, especially if a neighbour whose character was unimpeachable had been condemned. The same rumour that once inflated accusations could just as easily turn against judges, painting them as corrupt or cruel. The social economy of accusation reveals that witchcraft was less about demons than about communities policing themselves. A village that blamed witches for misfortune was a village trying to restore equilibrium by identifying culprits. The witch hunter formalized the process, but the real hunters were neighbors whose grievances, fears, and envies were given theological and judicial clothing. When historians read trial records today, they see not only superstition, but sociology, how poverty, envy, inheritance disputes, and gender roles shape the story of the witch. A quarrel over a cow could escalate into a narrative of nocturnal Sabbaths. A bitter rivalry over land could be clothed in accusations of maleficium. The witch hunter was the notary, the village was the author. And so, in a paradox that later centuries never tired of pointing out, the witch craze was communal self-destruction. People burned neighbours not because they were strangers, but because they were too familiar. The hunter's noose was woven from gossip, and every knot was tied in the name of restoring peace. The village could point the finger, but it was the courtroom that gave suspicion its teeth. In the world of late medieval and early modern justice, proof was a fragile commodity. A lightning strike, a stillborn calf, or a quarrel overheard at market could be taken as half-proof. Half-proof demanded more, and that more was almost always sought in the words of the accused herself. Yet no one expected witches to confess willingly. If they served the devil, they would lie. If they lied, only pain could strip away the mask. Out of this grim syllogism grew the machinery that turned rumour into conviction, torture as a tool of truth. The manuals left nothing to imagination. Judges trained in Roman canonical procedure knew that confessions were the queen of proofs. They also knew that torture was permitted when suspicion was grave but not conclusive. The result was a ritual theatre in which the accused was bound, questioned, and promised mercy if she told the truth, only to discover that every denial justified further tightening of the ropes. Once the threshold was crossed, confession was less a discovery than a performance scripted in advance. Descriptions from trial records are chilling, not because of lurid detail, but because of their bureaucratic calm. A notary writes that the accused was stretched but not broken, or that she persisted in silence until compelled by torment to speak. The words she spoke were often the very phrases the interrogators had already suggested. Yes, she consorted with other women at night. Yes, she anointed herself with a salve. Yes, she renounced her baptism and signed a pact. The notary wrote it down, the judge accepted it, and the process moved inexorably forward. Once a confession existed, it demanded names. Judges asked, "Who else was present at the Sabbath? Whose face did you see?" Pain provided memory where none had been. Neighbours and rivals were named, and the circle widened. One woman's confession could produce 10 more arrests, each of which yielded more confessions, each of which expanded the map of alleged conspirators. The logic was recursive, and in regions like southern Germany and Switzerland, it turned small trials into frenzies that consumed hundreds. Torture did not operate in isolation, it was embedded in a ritual of proof. Before a woman was tortured, her body was searched for witch marks, moles, scars, or calluses interpreted as the devil's seal. If the mark did not bleed when pricked, it was evidence. If the accused floated when thrown into water, it was evidence. If she sank, she was guilty but drowned before conviction. These ordeals were justified as appeals to divine judgment, but in practice they provided further confirmation of what judges already believed. Torture simply sealed the matter. The tragedy is that many accused did not even resist. Exhausted by imprisonment, shamed by neighbours, stripped of protection, they confessed without torment. Some believed the accusations, convinced by sermons that the devil had indeed deceived them. Others confessed in hope of a swift death, trading silence and more pain for words and an end. Their statements read with a heartbreaking simplicity. Yes, I made a pact. Yes, I harmed the child. Yes, I called the storm truth mattered less than closure. The reliance on torture shaped the very content of witchcraft beliefs. Because judges asked about Sabbaths, suspects described Sabbaths. Because they were asked about pacts, they told of pacts. The cosmology of the witch, the flight, the feast, the devil's caress, was in large measure a creation of interrogation. Folklore provided fragments. The courtroom stitched them into narratives. The hammer and the rack did not merely extract truth, they manufactured it. Yet even within this grim machinery, skepticism occasionally surfaced. Some judges doubted confessions obtained under torment, noting that victims would say anything to stop the pain. Higher courts in France and the Low Countries sometimes overturned convictions, insisting on stricter standards of proof. In England, where common law forbade judicial torture, trials relied more on witness testimony and less on confessions wrung from the body. Execution rates were lower, though not absent. These contrasts remind us that witch hunting was never monolithic. It varied with legal culture as much as with theology. Still, in the regions where torture was accepted, the process took on the momentum of inevitability. Communities demanded answers, judges demanded confessions, torture provided them. The cycle could continue until panic reached the elite. When accusations began to touch the families of magistrates and clergy, when confessions named priests or counsellors, skepticism hardened into restraint. The same procedure that had once seemed a guarantor of truth was suddenly seen as a danger to stability. Trials subsided, not because pity triumphed, but because politics did. The witch hunter, in this setting, was less an individual than a functionary of the system. He believed himself to be pursuing evidence, yet he was often producing it. He thought he was unmasking conspiracies, yet he was creating them. The community wanted reassurance that misfortune had a culprit, and the court provided it through ritualized pain. The execution ground became the final proof. The witch confessed, the witch was punished, the world was restored to order. What remains most haunting is the silence in the archives. The words of the accused survive only as transcripts, stripped of tone and context. We read them as historians knowing they were shaped by fear, pain, and suggestion. But to contemporaries, they sounded like truth, and truth justified the pyre. The machinery of proof, designed to guarantee justice, ended by feeding injustice. In a paradox that defines the era, the more carefully judges followed procedure, the more certain the outcome became, regardless of reality. Torture was not an aberration of the hunt. It was its engine. Without it, rumour might have burned out. With it, rumour became confession. Confession became evidence, and evidence became death. The 17th century opened with smoke already rising from village commons and market squares. What had begun in scattered trials of neighbours became, in this century, a continental fever. The figure of the witch ceased to be the quarrelsome midwife or the resentful widow and grew into a cosmic enemy, imagined as part of a vast conspiracy against Christian society. From Scotland's moors to the forests of Poland, from the Alpine valleys to the Baltic shores, suspicion flared into mass hunts that consumed whole communities. The century earned its place in memory not because witchcraft was new, but because fear finally metastasized into system. The conditions were ripe. Europe reeled from religious wars that pitted Catholic against Protestant, cousin against cousin. Famine struck often, driven by the chill of the Little Ice Age and the destruction of armies. Plague still visited towns with terrifying regularity. In this world, disaster cried out for explanation, and sermons gave it a name: witches. Priests and pastors of rival confessions found rare agreement in blaming sorcery. In Lutheran Saxony and Catholic Bavaria alike, pulpits thundered that the devil walked with human servants, and those servants were hiding in plain sight. The message trickled into every village tavern and every gossip circle. The reason the crops rotted or the baby failed to thrive was not fate, but malice. The machinery of justice expanded to meet demand. In the German territories, fragmented into hundreds of jurisdictions, local rulers competed to prove their godliness and their zeal. Trials became a way to demonstrate both. In places like Bamberg and Würzburg, bishops oversaw panic so vast that entire neighborhoods emptied into prisons. Children testified against parents, servants against masters, rivals against rivals. Confessions, squeezed out by the rack, multiplied names until hundreds were accused. In Würzburg, even boys at a cathedral choir were burned, accused of learning diabolical songs. The witch was no longer the neighbour on the margins. She was anyone unlucky enough to be pointed at. Scotland too flared. King James VI, later James I of England, had taken personal interest in witchcraft, even writing a treatise, Daemonology, that insisted on the reality of witches' pacts and Sabbaths. Under his reign, and in the decades following, Scottish courts pursued witches with ferocity unmatched elsewhere in the British Isles. Villagers saw waves of accusations, and confessions were coloured by the peculiar imagination of the time: witches sailing in sieves, witches feasting with the devil, witches sending storms against fleets. The imagery, imported from continental demonology, blended with local folklore until it seemed unassailable truth. France saw panics in Lorraine and Normandy, Poland in Podlasie and Royal Prussia, Switzerland in the Vaud and Fribourg. Each had its own rhythms, but the pattern was shared. Local calamity sparked suspicion. Suspicion produced trials. Trials multiplied through torture, and executions confirmed to the public that the danger had been real. The stake in the village square was not only punishment, but performance. The flames proved that order had been restored, that God's enemies had been defeated, that the community had cleansed itself. For a time, people slept easier, until the next storm, the next famine, the next fever. What distinguished the 17th century was not merely numbers, but scale of imagination. The witch was now described as part of an international conspiracy. Demonological treatises circulated through print shops, filled with lurid details of Sabbaths where witches gathered by thousands, kissing the devil, plotting plagues, poisoning wells. Judges asked about these stories in interrogation, and confessions confirmed them, completing the circle. The witch was no longer a solitary figure, but a soldier in a cosmic army. To execute her was not only to settle a village quarrel, but to strike a blow in a universal war between God and Satan. The sheer breadth of panic reveals itself in statistics. Historians estimate that between 40 and 60,000 people were executed for witchcraft in Europe between the 15th and 18th centuries, the majority during the 17th. Tens of thousands more were tried, imprisoned, whipped, or banished. The victims were overwhelmingly women, but not exclusively. In some regions, especially in Iceland and Normandy, men made up significant portions of the accused. Children were not exempt. Records tell of young boys and girls who confessed under questioning to attending Sabbaths and who paid with their lives. No one was entirely safe once the circle of suspicion widened. Yet even at the height of frenzy, skepticism existed. Higher courts in France, especially the Parlement of Paris, frequently overturned local convictions, insisting on stricter evidence. In England, common law procedure required witnesses and resisted torture, producing fewer executions despite occasional panics. Dutch provinces, with their commercial pragmatism, grew reluctant to waste resources on trials and gradually abandoned them. These contrasts remind us that witch hunting was never universal. It was regional, shaped by law and culture as much as by fear. Still, where it raged, it left scars deep enough to shape memory for centuries. Villages depopulated, families destroyed, landscapes haunted by pyres. Chroniclers wrote in tones of awe at the numbers, as if the scale itself confirmed righteousness. Survivors remembered differently. Some left quiet notes in diaries about neighbours unjustly condemned, about the arbitrariness of accusation, about fear so pervasive that every smile or frown might be fatal. By the century's end, the tide began to turn. The very excess of panic sowed doubt. When respected citizens, councillors, even clergy were caught in the widening net, elites recognized the danger of letting trials run unchecked. Skeptical voices in law and philosophy gained traction. Jurists like Friedrich Spee, a Jesuit who heard countless confessions from tortured women, published works denouncing the cruelty and futility of the process. Philosophers in the new scientific societies whispered that storms had meteorological causes, not diabolical ones. Physicians argued that illness came from humours, not hexes. Slowly, explanation shifted, and with it, the appetite for trials waned. But the memory of the 17th century remained seared into Europe's consciousness. It was the time when the witch ceased to be rumour and became policy, when communal fear fused with state power to produce execution on an industrial scale. The figure of the witch hunter hardened into stereotype, a man with Bible and warrant, chasing invisible enemies, producing very real flames. The century of fire ended not with a single decree, but with exhaustion. Communities could not keep burning neighbours forever without unravelling themselves. By the early 18th century, skepticism prevailed in more courts than zeal. The hunts dwindled, though isolated trials lingered. The great bonfires dimmed, leaving behind only ash, fear, and stories. The witch survived, but only as memory and as myth. The neighbour with herbs became the caricature in a demonology, then the victim in a panic, then the ghost in folklore. The hunter survived too, but only as a figure in history books, a symbol of credulity and cruelty. Together, they left Europe haunted by its own attempt to explain misfortune through the language of the diabolical. By the 18th century, the air over Europe was clearer, though not free of smoke. The flames that had once consumed thousands had dwindled to embers, and those embers flickered only in isolated corners. The witch as a living neighbour to be hunted and punished was fading, replaced by the witch as a memory, a story, a cautionary figure. The decline was uneven, slow in some places, abrupt in others, but it was unmistakable. The machinery that had once driven whole villages to frenzy lost its gears. The causes of this decline were many, and none acted alone. One was sheer exhaustion. After decades of trials, communities began to notice the toll not just on the accused, but on themselves. Executions emptied villages, confiscations impoverished families, rumour poisoned trust. In regions where panics had burned hottest, Franconia, Lorraine, the Swiss cantons, the devastation was so obvious that skepticism was no longer philosophical but practical. People recognized that a village could not thrive if half its members were consumed by suspicion and the other half by guilt. Another cause was intellectual. The Enlightenment did not arrive everywhere at once, but its whisper was already audible in courts and universities. Philosophers, natural scientists, and physicians proposed alternative explanations for calamities. Lightning was electrical discharge, not the devil's weapon. Illness came from contagion and humours, not from spells cast in envy. Crop failure could be traced to weather patterns and soil exhaustion, not maleficium. These explanations did not spread to every hearth, but they gave magistrates a reason to hesitate. If storms and sickness had natural causes, then the accused might be innocent. Skepticism gained a vocabulary. Law played its part too. Higher courts increasingly restricted the use of torture or demanded stricter forms of evidence. In France, the Parlement of Paris quashed local convictions, weary of the zealotry of provincial judges. In England, the common law's reliance on witnesses rather than confessions made mass panics difficult to sustain. In the Dutch Republic, commerce bred pragmatism. Trials were seen as wasteful distractions from trade. By mid-century, statutes against witchcraft lingered on the books, but were rarely enforced. Religion itself shifted. The confessional wars that had fueled suspicion calmed into uneasy toleration. Catholic and Protestant rulers alike discovered that stability was more valuable than spectacle. Priests and pastors still warned of the devil, but the pulpit thunder grew softer. A world that had once seen witches as soldiers in a cosmic army began to treat them as relics of a credulous past. In sermons, the witch became a symbol of error, not a neighbour to be burned. Yet the memory of the hunts refused to fade entirely. Folklore carried it forward, often stripped of theology, but rich in colour. Children were warned not to stray into the forest, lest witches seize them. Old women in cottages were joked about as sorceresses. Festivals included mock trials, where a witch was symbolically punished, not killed, but laughed at. The terror that once fueled executions became the stuff of cautionary tales and carnival skits. The witch survived by changing costume. Historians of later centuries took up the story with unease. In the 19th century, the witch hunt became a symbol of dark medieval superstition, contrasted with the light of modern rationality. The Iron Maiden, a device never truly medieval, was exhibited in museums as proof of Gothic cruelty. The witch became an object of both horror and fascination, a character in Romantic poetry and Gothic novels. Scholars and writers used her to condemn the past and to explore the boundaries of fear and imagination. The figure of the witch hunter changed as well. In the 17th century, he had been a magistrate or preacher, often respected in his own community. By the 18th and 19th centuries, he was remembered as a fanatic, a bigot, a man whose credulity destroyed innocence. The stereotype hardened. The witch hunter was the villain of history, proof of how easily fear can corrupt justice. He haunted memory as much as the witch herself. Modern historiography has continued to wrestle with this legacy. In the 20th century, scholars uncovered trial records in archives, reconstructing the lives of the accused and the machinery of persecution. They found patterns, the role of gender, the economics of property disputes, the politics of small jurisdictions. They showed that witch hunts were not irrational eruptions in a vacuum, but deeply embedded in the social fabric of early modern Europe. At the same time, they recognized the suffering of thousands whose voices survive only in confessions shaped by pain. The witch became not just a character in folklore, but a victim in history. Even today, the imagery of the witch hunt lingers. The phrase itself has become metaphor for unjust persecution, invoked in politics, journalism, and art. The irony is sharp. The very language of the hunts once used to condemn neighbours is now used to condemn overzealous accusers. The past shadows the present, reminding societies how easily fear can dress itself in legal robes. And so the story closes, not with a final pyre, but with reflection. The Middle Ages gave Europe the figure of the cunning woman and the maleficent neighbour. The 16th and 17th centuries turned her into a cosmic enemy and communities into engines of self-destruction. The 18th century dismantled the machinery, and the 19th reinvented the memory as symbol. The witch hunter himself faded, leaving only cautionary lessons about law, belief, and the fragility of justice. The woman drying herbs by the hearth was never new. What was new was the decision to see her as part of a plot that stretched from neighbourly quarrel to the throne of Satan. The man with the seal and the rope was never monstrous in his own eyes. He thought himself guardian of order. Together they created a tragedy that consumed thousands and left Europe scarred. Their story remains because it speaks not only to superstition, but to the human hunger for explanations, the fear of disorder, and the price of certainty. The witch hunt is over, but the questions it raised about fear, about justice, about the power of communities to destroy their own, still burn. Moving on to our next story. We'll explore the methods pirates use to punish their prisoners and victims. Settle in and get ready to listen along. The first thing a prisoner learns on a pirate ship is that freedom and democracy are luxuries reserved for the crew, not for those who fall into their hands. Life aboard runs on articles agreed at the voyage's start, a rough constitution that grants every man his share of plunder and his say in decisions, but also binds him to rules sharper than any blade. For outsiders, captains of merchantmen, unlucky passengers, sailors dragged from their hammocks in the middle of the night, the same spirit of order is expressed in punishment. Pirates punish to make examples, to frighten the next ship into lowering its flag without a shot, and to keep their own floating republic from rotting from within. Terror is both tool and trade. The quarterdeck becomes a stage. The condemned is hauled up in front of the assembled company, and the articles are read aloud, their clauses rolled out like scripture. A thief who pilfered from the common chest, a coward who shrank in battle, a mutineer who whispered too loudly. Each is displayed to the crew as a reminder that even in a world of thieves, law must be obeyed. Punishments vary, but they always follow the same logic. They are designed to leave scars on memory as much as on flesh. The lash, the knotted rope tails soaked in brine, cuts red lines across a man's back until he remembers his duty. Running the gauntlet between two rows of shipmates' fists and lines teaches that every theft is from every brother. Sometimes an ear is nailed to the mast, left until the nail is pulled free with the flesh, a mark that the man will carry into every tavern he enters for the rest of his life. Captives feel another version of this theatre. A merchant master who resisted too long may be tied to a gun and forced to watch as his cargo is parcelled out. A passenger who boasted of wealth may be stripped, mocked, and left with nothing but rags. Sometimes the cruelty is slow, sweating in a closed hold lit with lanterns until the air itself becomes a torment. Sometimes it is quick, the simple shove over the side in waters known to be thick with sharks. Death is not always the point. Pirates often prefer humiliation because humiliation travels farther. A master who limps back into port with his beard singed and his pride destroyed tells a story that frightens more effectively than corpses ever could. Even among themselves, pirates enforce obedience with ferocity. Their democracy is not gentle. A captain who loses the confidence of his men may be voted out and set ashore. A shipmate caught stealing is likely to be marooned, left on a barren quay with a bottle of water, a musket, and a single shot, just enough to prolong despair. The logic is brutal but efficient. It spares the crew the stain of blood on their deck and leaves the sea to finish the sentence. Stories of marooned men who survived, feeding on turtles or salvaging rainwater from leaves, became part of the folklore of the trade, half warning, half inspiration. But most never returned, and the silence of their fate was louder than any sermon. Punishment is never random. It is calculated to maintain the delicate balance of terror that keeps the enterprise alive. Too much cruelty, and a captain earns mutiny. Too little, and discipline rots. So punishments are chosen with care. Enough spectacle to terrify, enough restraint to keep the crew's loyalty. A man half drowned in a ducking is more useful than a corpse. A marooned thief teaches thrift to those who remain. A merchant spared after humiliation will spread fear in every harbour he reaches. Pirates understood what merchants, admirals, and governors often forgot. Fear is the cheapest weapon at sea, and the stories told in its service are worth more than cannon shot. The victims of these punishments, pirates and prisoners alike, carried the lessons in their scars and their silences. In taverns from Tortuga to Kingston, men told and retold tales of lashings, maroonings, duckings, and mutilations until the punishments became larger than life. They grew into myths of planks and keelholes, stories that outlived the men who first endured them. For pirates, that was the real dividend. Each punishment was not only a sentence but an investment, a rumour set adrift that would frighten the next ship into surrendering without a fight. And as long as those stories travelled faster than the Black Flag itself, the pirate's Republic of Fear held firm. He learns quickly that the sea itself can become the judge, and the ship its courtroom. When punishment demands spectacle, there is no theatre more frightening than the ocean. Among the most dreaded threats, whispered more than it was ever carried out, is the dragging of a man beneath the keel. Navies codified it into their books of discipline, but pirates understood its value as legend. To be tied to a rope, pulled under the hull, scraped against barnacles and half drowned, it was the kind of story that travelled from mouth to mouth until it became bigger than any single event. Pirates rarely needed to do it. The fear of it was enough. The mechanics were simple. A rope passed under the hull, a man tied hand and foot, the crew at the falls ready to haul. He vanished on one side of the ship and reappeared, gasping and bloodied, on the other. The sea itself did the work, water filling his lungs, darkness choking him, the unseen hull grinding past his skin. Once was lesson enough, though some captains ordered it twice for emphasis. Survivors bore cuts and bruises, but what mattered most was what they carried in their eyes, the memory of salt and suffocation. For their shipmates, that look was a warning more eloquent than any words. Other punishments relied on the ocean's indifference in subtler ways. A man guilty of theft or cowardice might be bound and lowered head first from the bow, plunged again and again into the swell until terror replaced defiance. Prisoners were sometimes trailed astern on ropes, their bodies smacking the waves, sharks circling hungrily in the wake. Even when death did not come, the ordeal taught obedience. A single choking gasp could discipline a crew more effectively than 100 lashes. Legends embroidered these practices into monstrosities. Ballads spoke of men shredded by barnacles, of pirates who keel-hauled captives for sport, of hulls painted red with blood. The reality was rarer and more pragmatic. Pirates valued fear more than cruelty. A dead sailor was one fewer set of hands. A broken man who survived to tell his story in port was worth 10 corpses. The keel, the ducking, the trailing. These punishments were sparingly used, but they loomed large in imagination. The ocean gave pirates a language that required no translation. Every man at sea, whether merchant or navy, knew what it meant to be dropped overboard with hands bound. They knew the taste of salt water, the weight of panic in the chest. By turning that universal fear into a punishment, pirates tapped into a reservoir of dread that needed no embellishment. A rope hanging coiled at the rail was a warning in itself. Men whispered about it at night, and the whispers carried ashore, spreading the reputation of captains who might never have needed to order it in the first place. For prisoners, the lesson was sharper still. A merchant officer, stripped and bound, dunked until he admitted where he had hidden his valuables, was far more cooperative afterward. A sailor who had seen his mate trailed half-drowned astern was quicker to drop his knife and surrender. Pirates understood that terror was a resource to be husbanded. A single public ordeal could save powder, time, and lives. The sea was inexhaustible, and so was its reputation as executioner. The men who endured these punishments often became unwilling heralds of pirate justice. Hauled aboard, coughing and scarred, set free at the next port, they told stories over tankards that were half truth and half nightmare. Audiences leaned closer when they described the crushing darkness under the hull, the sense that the ocean itself had swallowed them whole. These stories spread faster than any ship, ensuring that the next crew to see a black flag thought twice before resisting. Fear of punishment was itself a form of discipline, and the pirates knew it. And so the sea remained both ally and weapon. Its punishments were unpredictable, sometimes merciful, sometimes fatal, but always memorable. Pirates used it sparingly, knowing that even the rumour of keel-hauling or ducking could hold a crew together, could silence dissent, could persuade a merchantman to strike its colours without a fight. The ocean did not care, but pirates did. They needed their punishments to echo louder than gunfire, to last longer than bruises, to ripple through taverns and harbours until their very names carried the taste of salt and fear. He sees the island long before the skiff grates against its white sand, and in that moment he understands what pirates mean when they talk about justice. Marooning is not simply exile, it is the most elegant cruelty the sea has devised. It costs nothing but a cask of water, a handful of biscuits, perhaps a musket with a single shot if the crew feels generous. It leaves no bloodstains on the planks, no corpse to weigh down the hold. Instead, it turns the very horizon into a prison wall, and it makes the condemned his own executioner. The men who push him ashore know this. The captain knows it. The condemned knows it most of all. The practice has roots older than the golden age of piracy. Spanish sailors spoke of cimarrones, runaways, wild things, those abandoned to fend for themselves. Privateers in the long wars adopted the habit. It was tidier than hanging and cheaper than shot. By the 17th century, it was established custom among sea rovers from the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean. When buccaneers on Tortuga argued over shares or discipline, the losing man might find himself abandoned on one of the cays that dotted the Bahamas. When a mutiny failed, the ringleader was pushed ashore with just enough supplies to keep hope alive. Pirates did not pretend it was mercy, they pretended it was choice. You may live if you can. More often, you may die slowly, with time to regret. There were degrees to the punishment, and every crew knew how to calibrate them. The harshest form was abandonment on a barren sand spit. No tree for shade, no spring for water, nothing but gulls and crabs. A man set down there with a pistol and one charge understood at once what the weapon was for. Less cruel, but still merciless, was marooning on a larger island where food might be found. Pigs roamed some of the cays, left long ago by Spaniards for resupply. Sea turtles crawled ashore at night to bury their eggs in the sand. Fresh water could sometimes be coaxed out of the ground by digging in the right place. In such cases, survival was possible. Stories circulated of men who lived months or years in solitude before being picked up by chance. These stories fascinated sailors because they made the punishment into a lottery. One man's death sentence was another man's legend. Alexander Selkirk was no pirate, but a Scottish navigator, and his quarrel with his captain ended with him left on Juan Fernandez Island in the South Pacific. He survived more than 4 years, fashioning clothes from goatskins, taming cats for company, reading his Bible aloud to keep speech in his mouth. When he was rescued, he had become almost mythic, and his story inspired Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. Pirates knew his tale, and it haunted their practice. To maroon a man was not always to kill him. Sometimes it was to make him into a parable. The possibility of survival, however faint, gave the punishment its strange edge of fairness. "We did not murder him," crews could claim. "We gave him a chance." But chance was a thin comfort. More often the islands chosen were too small to sustain life or too remote for rescue. Men left on them quickly learned the sound of despair, the empty thump of waves against sand, the shriek of seabirds overhead, the long silence of nights broken only by their own breathing. Some tried to swim after the departing boats, flailing until exhaustion forced them back to shore. Others sat on the beach until the shape of the ship dwindled to a speck, knowing it would never return. The pistol, when provided, was both companion and verdict. Survivors later recalled that the knowledge of that single shot pressed harder on the mind than hunger did on the belly. Pirates also used marooning against captives when death would have been wasteful or politically dangerous. Killing every prisoner risked reprisals from colonial authorities, but setting them ashore on an uninhabited coast satisfied the crew's anger while preserving deniability. Captains spared too many lives risked being seen as weak. Captains who killed too freely risked mutiny. Marooning balanced both dangers. The victims might survive and limp into a Spanish or English port with stories of cruelty, and those stories did more damage to morale than any single battle. Merchant captains, remembering them, surrendered faster the next time. In this way, marooning became a kind of marketing. Pirates exported fear without expending powder. Among their own, the punishment carried political weight. The pirate ship was a democracy of sorts, but democracy requires discipline. Charles Vane learned this when his crew judged him a coward for refusing battle against a superior enemy. They deposed him, voted for a new captain, and marooned him on a tiny island. Fortune gave him temporary rescue, but soon enough, he was captured and hanged. His marooning lived longer than his command. It reminded every captain that his authority depended on the consent of his crew, and that consent could be revoked with a vote and a shove into a skiff. The psychological terror of marooning reached further than its actual practice. Sailors spoke of it in whispers on calm nights, staring at the horizon and imagining themselves alone beyond it. The thought of endless water, of solitude without end, gnawed at even hardened buccaneers. In some ways, marooning was worse than execution. Death by bullet or blade was quick, the end of a heartbeat. To be marooned was to die slowly, to live in uncertainty, to face each dawn with diminishing hope. Pirates understood this instinctively. They preferred punishments that left survivors to spread tales of terror. Marooning accomplished both. It disposed of unwanted men and created stories that spread from port to port. The survivors who did make it back were changed. Some returned gaunt and silent, unable to speak of what they had endured. Others embroidered their tales in taverns, describing monstrous fish, ghostly voices, miraculous escapes. Each retelling thickened the aura of dread around the practice. Merchants whispered that pirates marooned men by the dozens. Sailors swore they had seen bones bleaching on deserted quays. The truth hardly mattered. The myth was enough. To be abandoned by your brothers on an island was to learn that the sea itself had turned against you. It was not just punishment, it was exile from the only community that mattered. The ship was family, home, law and livelihood. To lose it was to become less than human. That was the cruelest edge of marooning, not the hunger, not the thirst, not even the pistol with its single bullet, but the knowledge that you had been unmade as a pirate, cast out of the floating republic. And so men obeyed the articles, bit their tongues in quarrels, and voted with care. They knew the price of disobedience was not only pain, but silence. The silence of waves on sand, the silence of empty horizons, the silence of a name whispered in fear long after the man himself was gone. Pirates punished with the lash and with the rope, but when they wanted to punish with eternity, they turned to the island. He learns that pirate justice is not always as spectacular as a marooning or as legendary as a rope dragged under the keel. More often, it is ordinary, brutal, and practical. Punishments carried out in front of the crew to keep order alive in a place where law has no other anchor. The sea is wide, but a ship is small, and on a small stage, every quarrel, theft, or act of cowardice threatens to fracture the whole. The lash, the gauntlet, the knife, even the mockery of shaved heads or ruined clothes. These are the everyday instruments of discipline, and they shape life aboard as much as any compass or sail. The cat-o'-nine-tails was borrowed from the Navy, but pirates had no hesitation in using it. 9 knotted strands, stiff with tar and brine, could tear a man's back into welts after a dozen strokes. Yet compared to hanging or drowning, it was merciful. The victim lived to fight another day, and that mattered on a ship where every hand counted. Punishment by flogging was not hidden away but staged, the man tied to the grating, or mast, the crew ordered to watch. The purpose was less to cripple him than to remind every sailor present that order was the ship's real ballast. Salt rubbed into the wounds was not only cruel, but practical, preventing infection while deepening the sting. The scars became badges, warnings carved into skin that told every man what the articles meant. When the crew wished to share responsibility for punishment, they turned to the gauntlet. 2 rows of men formed on deck, each armed with a rope's end or a belaying pin, and the culprit was forced to walk between them. Every blow landed was a statement. Your crime was against us all. For theft, cheating at dice, or drawing steel on a brother, the gauntlet was a ritual of collective anger. It restored equilibrium by making everyone both punisher and witness. The man who emerged, bruised and broken, knew that reconciliation was possible only because the community had been satisfied. Yet there was risk. A gauntlet too severe could kill or maim, costing the crew a worker. A gauntlet too light could encourage defiance. A wise captain judged the mood, knowing that discipline was as delicate as rigging. Other punishments were designed to leave lasting marks. An ear nailed to the mast for the length of a watch taught patience by pain. Once freed, the ragged wound branded a man for life. In some ports, slit nostrils or branded cheeks proclaimed a thief even when he tried to desert. Pirates did not always kill, but they ensured their discipline followed a man ashore. A mutilated face spoke as loudly as a flag, warning others about disobedience. This permanence mattered in a society that thrived on rumour. A punished man carried his punishment into every tavern, extending the captain's authority beyond the deck. Mockery too had its place. A man caught boasting too loudly or shirking duty might find his beard shaved or his clothes cut to ribbons. These humiliations cost nothing and made the crew laugh, but they also reminded everyone that pride could be undone in an instant. Pirates knew that laughter could discipline as effectively as fear. A man who had been shaved bald or dressed in rags after a quarrel was unlikely to provoke his mates again. Ridicule lingered longer than bruises, gnawing at pride whenever the memory returned. Captives suffered their own share of inventive punishments. A stubborn merchant captain might be forced to scrub the deck in front of his own crew, or paraded with ropes tied around his neck. Some were made to dance under threat of pistols, mocked as entertainment before their cargo was divided. Others were sweated, packed into a hold, lit with lanterns until the air grew unbearable, then questioned about hidden valuables. The point was always the same: to break resistance, to turn fear into compliance, and to leave survivors who would spread stories of pirate cruelty. Pirates understood that humiliation could travel farther than corpses, persuading future victims to surrender at the first sight of a black flag. The infamous image of walking the plank belongs more to novels than to history, yet its spirit was real. Men were pushed overboard, forced to jump at gunpoint, or left to flounder in waters known for sharks. Pirates did not bother with wooden planks. The sea itself was executioner enough. Yet by the 18th century, tales of victims walking out to doom on a board had spread through taverns and broadsheets. The myth endured because it was theatrical, neat, and memorable. Pirates themselves encouraged such stories because reputation was their strongest weapon. Whether or not a man had ever truly walked the plank, the belief that he might kept merchant crews trembling. Justice among pirates was always strategic. They punished not only to correct, but to terrify, to entertain, and to remind. Too much cruelty, and a captain risked mutiny. Too little, and discipline dissolved. Punishments were chosen with care, balancing severity with necessity. A flogging kept the crew in line without costing a life. A marooning satisfied anger while creating legends. A humiliation restored humour after tension. Pirates calculated their justice the way merchants calculated their accounts, knowing that the survival of their republic at sea depended on it. The daily life of a pirate ship was harsh, but it was not lawless. It was ordered by fear, laughter, rumour, and scars. Punishment stitched the community together reminding men that their freedom was conditional, bound by the articles they themselves had signed. Captives, watching these rituals, learned that resistance was folly. Sailors, remembering them, carried tales into every port. Governors and admirals heard those tales and cursed the difficulty of fighting enemies whose greatest weapon was reputation. And so pirate punishments lived longer than the men who endured them. They became myths: keel-hauling, the plank, the lonely island. But behind the myths lay a hard truth. Pirates punished as much with imagination as with rope. They knew that the echo of a punishment mattered more than the punishment itself. A scar, a rumour, a story told in a tavern could frighten 100 men into surrender. Discipline, terror, and theatre blended until they were indistinguishable. The lash cracked, the crowd laughed, the condemned cried, and the black flag sailed on, heavier with legend than with loot. Our next story will be just as interesting. Settle in, because we'll explore the history and myths behind Masonic lodges. He is not born in a lodge, and nothing about his first years suggests a mystery. He is a boy on a building site, a runner with sand in his shoes, carrying messages between men who speak with chalk on stone and measure with strings pulled tight as harp lines. The air is powdered with lime. The world smells of wet timber and new mortar. A half-raised wall throws a cool shadow. At the centre of it, all stands the tracing floor, chalked with arcs and intersecting lines, the geometry of a future carved into dust. If there is a cult here, it is the cult of making, blocks fitted so fine that a blade of grass cannot pass between them, arches that seem to float and then outlive their makers. The word lodge is only a hut, boards, a hearth, a chest with contracts and wages. The secrets, such as they are, belong to a craft. For centuries, Europe fills itself with stone. Cathedrals rise like frozen prayers. Guild halls grow fat beside rivers. Bridges step from bank to bank with the confidence of giants. Wherever stone climbs, masons camp. They are not townsmen. The site is their town. They wander from contract to contract, and their knowledge must travel too. How to square a block without wasting it, how to turn a circle into a vault, how to calculate thrust without the Latin many preachers own. In this world, secrecy begins as prudence. A man feeds his family with what his hands know, and he protects that knowledge from the unskilled who would sell it cheaply. Passwords and signs keep impostors from claiming a wage they cannot earn. Rituals, which to the outsider look like nonsense and to the mason look like memory, score those passwords into the mind. An apprentice kneels and receives a word he must not say outside the lodge. A fellow craft passes a set of grips that let him be recognized on the next site. A master earns a privilege that is not yet quite a metaphor. The lodges are practical councils before they are anything else. They set wages, settle quarrels, take up collections for widows and for men hurt by a misjudged stone. They keep a small library of charges, narratives that tell a young mason who he is supposed to be. In one set of those old charges, copied and recopied from the 14th century onward, the craft claims descent from Euclid teaching geometry in Egypt, then from the builders of King Solomon's temple. No clerk believes these origin stories literally, but they do their work. They give a working man a pedigree that reaches farther than his village. They dignify the use of a square and a compass by tying them to divine architecture. When a master reads aloud that a mason must be true to God and Holy Church, must not cheat his employer, must keep his brother's secrets securely, he is not plotting against kings. He is teaching a code to men in a dangerous trade. Scotland gives the craft sharper lines. In the 1590s, the Shaw Statutes, named for William Shaw, Master of Works to the Crown, organised lodges in and around Edinburgh into something like a jurisdiction. They register members, require apprentices to serve proper terms, prescribe examinations, insist that masters keep their marks, require lodges to keep minutes. A mason word is mentioned, a means of recognition that should not be shared with cowans, those outside the craft. The word is not sorcery, it is safety. You do not put tools in the hand of a man whose skill you cannot verify, nor do you trust him 3 stories up on a scaffold when wind tears at the tops and the arch has not yet found its balance. Trust needs a language more intimate than wages. The lodge, with its passwords and catechisms, provides it. Elsewhere, the guilds are less centralised, more local, but the gestures rhyme. In England, the London Company of Masons guards its charters, polices the city line between freemen and outsiders, and fines men who take unlicensed work. In Germany, the Bauhütten, cathedral workshops, keep their own order, and Strasbourg's lodge carries something like authority across the Upper Rhine. On their walls, tools are hung not as ornaments but as proofs of belonging: the square, the level, the plumb, the chisel, the gavel. Men say square conduct and level dealing without thinking they are speaking allegory. The tools have long since become ethics. A man who would be a master must show he can use them both ways. A culture grows around this need for recognition. It includes practical tricks that stand like folklore, stories of how to heat a chisel to just the right colour in a dim shop, recipes for mortars that last when winter gnaws at joints, rules for when to brace a flying buttress, when to let a wall rest, when to say to a steward that a schedule is a lie. It includes also a habit of telling the past back to oneself. A mason in York or Cologne whispers the temple again while he eats his bread and onion at midday because it makes sense of the ache in his shoulders and the chalk in his lungs. Servants of Solomon rather than servants of penny-pinching cannons. The fiction makes the day's insults easier to bear. Secrecy in such a setting is not a conspiracy. It is identity. You belong to something that crosses parishes, languages and borders, and you need that belonging if you are to live by your wits and your hands. Even in these strictly operative years, a second gate opens. Gentlemen begin to knock. Wealthy patrons, local notables, men with Latin who want to belong to something that looks both ancient and respectable. It is not a flood yet. A clerk may be admitted for love, as the minutes sometimes say, because the lodge owes him a favour, or because he has funds and a future job to award. An aristocrat may be written in because his name could help when the town council grows pious and considers taxing a fraternity it does not understand. These accepted masons do not lay stone, but they learn the word and hear the charges. In them, the craft discovers something it will learn to like: protection, connections, and a second reason to meet that has little to do with scaffolding. The lodge feels its first tug towards symbolism for its own sake. Where there are oaths, there are always suspicions from outside. The church watches fraternities and sometimes tolerates and sometimes disciplines them, more anxious about clandestine meetings than about prayer. Town councils worry that men who promise obedience to one another may resist civic rule the next time wages are cut. But none of this produces yet the dark stain of secret society. The lodges in the 15th and 16th centuries are still workshops with customs. They carry candles because they work by candlelight. They speak quietly because they are tired, not because they are plotting to remake the world. What draws them toward mystery is less choice than accident. Cathedrals stop rising as often. Renaissance princes prefer palaces with stucco and fresco to Gothic ribs and webs. Fortification specialists, engineers with mathematics in their sleeves and cannon smoke in their hair, begin to hog the prestige once reserved for architects in stone. The old mobile fraternity faces stillness. It can either become a local club of builders with less to build, or it can become something else. The lodge, born as a shelter from rain and a place to keep wage books dry, proves to be a convenient vessel. It already knows how to meet, how to administer oaths, how to memorize words. It already knows how to make men feel like brothers. In Scotland, the transformation takes its first clear shape. Those accepted gentlemen begin to dominate roles. The mason word becomes less a test of employment and more a badge of belonging. Rituals, once mnemonic devices for trade knowledge, stretch into moral drama. The square and compasses tilt toward allegory. A story is refined, not newly invented so much as cleanly told, about a temple, a master who dies, a word lost and recovered. The drama teaches that a man is more than his wage, that death can be faced with a clean conscience, that fidelity to a promise is a form of architecture in the soul. Secrecy shifts subtly from protection of technique to protection of myth. You no longer hide how to dress a joint. You hide a narrative because the lesson has more power when it is spoken in a circle, not shouted in a market. Meanwhile, in England, an accident of timing will make a date that future histories will use as a beginning, 1717. 4 London lodges, St. Paul's, the Goose and Gridiron, the Apple Tree, the Rummer and Grapes, agree to meet together and coordinate, electing a Grand Master. They are a mixture of operative remnants and speculative enthusiasts, men who build no walls and men who cannot stop talking about them. They codify old customs, write new constitutions, publish a book that will travel faster than any journeyman with a sack on his back. What spills from that decision is both surprisingly old and surprisingly new. Oaths, grips, passwords, charges about honesty, obedience to law, charity to brothers, and reverence for the great architect of the universe, a title that allows piety without theologians' quarrels. From that moment, the cult exists in the modern sense, though calling it a cult says more about the anxieties of outsiders than about the content of the meetings. What began as a workman's shelter has become a fraternity that promises moral instruction through enacted stories, belonging through mutual recognition, charity through dues, and a polite refuge from the feverish politics of a Europe now learning to read pamphlets with more rage than grace. The secrecy that started as practical is now also emphatic. It sets the fraternity apart, makes its walls visible even to those who cannot enter. And because human nature cannot resist a closed door, it begins to attract rumours. In the villages that built the old cathedrals, a lodge was a hut with a chest and a pot. In the cities that will home the new Freemasonry, a lodge is a room with candles and a floor plan encoded in symbols. East for the rising light, west for the departing day. A tessellated pavement under a set of pillars that most members will never see, except in pictures, and yet feel as intimately as their own kitchens. Men who never laid a single block learn to stand by a plum because the world around them has ceased to be plumb. In an age of religious war and censorship, the promise of a space where dogma is muted and charity is praised becomes irresistible. And because the door is closed, the world outside invents what it cannot see. He, the boy who once carried chalk and water, is now an old master with more story than strength in his hands. He listens to gentlemen talk about liberty and geometry and thinks he recognizes something of the tracing flaw in their phrases. He recognizes the smell of warmed wax and the guttural syllables of the old words spoken softly. He recognizes, too, the danger of becoming what the stories say you are. Secrecy protects. It also invites. Between protection and invitation lies the narrow path where legends grow. Freemasonry will walk it for the next 3 centuries, acquiring mysteries as easily as a travelling mason acquires calluses, some useful, some only for show. The cult of making has become a culture of meaning, and soon enough, men who hate both will explain it to themselves as conspiracy. The lodges that began as gatherings of working masons had, by the early 18th century, turned into something very different. Gentlemen with powdered wigs and no calluses on their hands now filled the benches where craftsmen once compared wages. They called themselves speculative masons, using the language and symbols of the builder's craft not to raise arches, but to raise moral lessons. The square became a reminder of honesty, the compass a tool to keep passions within bounds, the level a sign of equality. A ritual that once confirmed a man's skill at stonework now staged his symbolic progress from darkness into light. The year 1717 is the date most often recited as a beginning. In London, 4 lodges met at a tavern called the Goose and Gridiron and resolved to join forces. they elected a Grand Master and began to meet in a more organised way. A few years later, the Presbyterian minister James Anderson published the Constitutions of the Freemasons, a blend of myth, regulation, and Enlightenment rhetoric. It repeated the old stories of Euclid and Solomon's Temple, but also insisted that Masons should be loyal to king and law, that they should avoid quarrels of religion, and that they should treat all members as brothers, regardless of rank. In a city still tense from sectarian strife, that sounded like a charter for civility. The attraction was immediate. Freemasonry promised fellowship across boundaries that normally kept men apart. A merchant could sit beside a duke, a soldier beside a scholar, and all would wear the same apron and repeat the same oaths. The rituals were private, but the reputation of privacy was public. Men outside wanted to know what went on inside, and when they were not told, they imagined. The secrecy that had once been practical now became social capital. To belong to a lodge was to belong to a circle whose boundaries glowed precisely because they were invisible. As lodges multiplied in Britain, the fraternity spread abroad. By the 1720s and 1730s, there were lodges in France, the Netherlands, and the German states. By mid-century, they had crossed the Atlantic to the American colonies. Everywhere they travelled, they adapted to local conditions. In Paris, lodges became fashionable salons where nobles and philosophes mingled. In provincial towns, they became clubs for professionals and merchants eager for a taste of cosmopolitan life. The oaths and grips were the same, but the social meaning varied. With growth came suspicion. Churches bristled at the fraternity's claim to unite men of all creeds under the vague worship of a great architect of the universe. To Catholic authorities, this looked like relativism, perhaps even heresy. In 1738, Pope Clement XII issued a bull condemning Freemasonry and forbidding Catholics to join. Secular rulers worried too. In autocratic states, any private gathering with oaths and rituals looked like a potential conspiracy. Even in Britain, where the fraternity had been born, pamphleteers began to publish mocking exposés, claiming to reveal the secret signs or the foolish ceremonies inside. The very things that attracted members, ritual, privacy, fraternity, became magnets for rumour. By the later 18th century, the fraternity had wrapped itself in both dignity and myth. Enlightenment thinkers praised its ideals of reason, equality, and brotherhood, while critics muttered about clandestine plots and foreign influence. Lodges flourished in the capitals of Europe and in colonial towns abroad, but the shadow of secrecy lengthened with every new member sworn to silence. What had started as a craft guild had now become an emblem of the age's contradictions. Rational in its language, mysterious in its practice, loyal to law but accused of plotting revolution. The cult of the Masons had been born not only from stone and symbol, but from the imagination of outsiders who could not resist filling closed doors with spectres. In the later 18th century, the map of Europe and the Americas began to shake. Revolutions broke out, thrones toppled, republics were proclaimed, and in the middle of all this turbulence stood men who also happened to be Masons. George Washington presided over an American army, and later over a young republic, while wearing the square and compasses on his apron. In France, noblemen who met in lodges to discuss philosophy found themselves drawn into the storms of 1789. Across Latin America, revolutionaries from Bolivar to San Martin would later be rumoured, sometimes truthfully and sometimes not, to have sworn their vows in candlelit rooms. It was inevitable that outsiders drew a line between the fraternity's closed doors and the upheaval shaking the world. In coffeehouses and pulpits, the charge was repeated. The Masons were not simply a club, but a conspiracy, plotting to overturn monarchy and altar alike. The evidence was circumstantial. Members happened to be leaders of movements, lodges happened to discuss Enlightenment ideals, but suspicion is most powerful when it requires no proof. Governments that felt themselves trembling found comfort in imagining a hidden hand guiding events. Masons themselves leaned into both sides of the picture. On one hand, lodges presented themselves as havens of reason and order. where men might meet as equals regardless of rank or confession. Their ceremonies borrowed language of architecture but promised moral building rather than political destruction. On the other hand, members were proud to imagine themselves part of something larger than parochial loyalties. When revolutions adopted slogans of liberty, equality, and fraternity, the echo of lodge language was impossible to miss. The fraternity had always claimed to unite men across divisions. In revolutionary times, that sounded very much like a manifesto. In the 19th century, accusations multiplied. Conservatives denounced Freemasonry as the invisible network undermining throne and church. In Catholic Europe, papal bulls thundered repeatedly, warning the faithful that Masonic oaths were incompatible with obedience to Rome. In monarchies struggling with liberal agitation, police infiltrated lodges and banned them outright. Every assassination attempt, every outbreak of unrest could be tied by rumor to the lodges. Secrecy made defense difficult. When you cannot prove what you do inside, others will happily invent it for you. Meanwhile, within the fraternity, the air of mystery deepened. Rituals expanded, layered with allegories of ancient builders, Templars, and even Egyptian mysteries. Higher degrees were invented, offering initiates a sense of climbing a symbolic ladder toward hidden wisdom. What had once been simple signs of recognition between craftsmen became elaborate dramas performed in candlelight. Outsiders, glimpsing fragments of this theatrical language, grew convinced that dark truths lay within. In reality, the plays were moral lessons dressed in costume, but secrecy magnified them into menacing myths. The paradox hardened. The more Masons insisted they were only a brotherhood devoted to charity, the more enemies imagined them as puppet masters pulling the strings of nations. The more governments banned them, the more radical groups adopted Masonic style as a mask for their own meetings. Conspiracies, real and imagined, wrapped themselves in the language of the square and compass until no one could easily tell symbol from substance. By the dawn of the 20th century, Masonry was everywhere and nowhere at once. Visible in parades and charitable works, invisible in the rumors that insisted it controlled banks, revolutions, and even the papacy. The cult of secrecy, once born of medieval craft necessity, had become a permanent costume. It gave its members dignity and belonging, but it also made them perpetual villains in the eyes of those who needed an enemy. In revolutionary centuries, that costume could not be shed. By the 19th century, Freemasonry had settled into every major city in Europe and the Americas, and its lodges were no longer just candlelit refuges for gentlemen. They marched in parades with banners and aprons, built hospitals and schools with funds collected from Jews, and presented themselves as public benefactors. Yet even as they grew more visible, the aura of secrecy around their rituals created a different picture in the imagination of outsiders. The fraternity was accused of being both too public and too hidden, both a benevolent society and a shadowy cabal. Writers helped to sharpen this double image. Romantic novelists filled pages with mysterious brotherhoods meeting under starlight, borrowing freely from the symbols of Masonry. The square and compass, the all-seeing eye, the pillars of Solomon's temple, these appeared in fiction as clues to ancient wisdom. To readers hungry for drama, the lodge was less a charitable club and more a portal into hidden history. Meanwhile, polemicists in politics and church used the same imagery to warn of dangerous plots. Every revolution, every anti-clerical movement, every new liberal party was said to be guided by Masonic hands. In Catholic Europe, papal condemnations became a steady drumbeat. Bulls issued through the century repeated the charge that the fraternity promoted religious indifferentism, placing loyalty to the lodge above loyalty to church. In monarchies like Austria or Spain, governments echoed these suspicions, banning lodges or forcing them underground. Each ban only deepened the sense of mystery. When meetings had to be held in secret, the suspicion of conspiracy seemed confirmed. A closed door feeds imagination more than an open one. At the same time, Masonry attracted members who enjoyed precisely this ambiguity. For some, it was an honourable club with charitable projects and a taste for ritual. For others, it was a place to network politically, to meet allies across class lines. In Latin America, independence movements used the form of lodges to organise gatherings that colonial authorities would otherwise have crushed. Whether or not those lodges were directly Masonic mattered less than the perception. The square and compass became shorthand for clandestine struggle. The 19th century also produced the first modern conspiracy theories in a recognisable form, and Masons stood at the centre of many. In France, Abbé Baruel's writings after the Revolution insisted that Freemasonry had been the true architect of the terror, guiding Jacobins from the shadows. In the United States, the disappearance of William Morgan in 1826, after he threatened to publish Masonic secrets, triggered the Anti-Masonic Party, the first third party in American politics. Newspapers filled with accusations that the fraternity shielded criminals and corrupted courts. Though the movement faded, it left a deep imprint. For many Americans, Masonry was less a fraternity than a secret state within a state. The fraternity responded with paradoxical strategies. It tried to be more transparent, publishing rituals shorn of their drama, emphasizing public charity, opening lodges for civic events, while also preserving its inner mysteries for members. This dual posture pleased few. Critics saw proof that Masons had something darker to hide. Members treasured the pageantry precisely because it was not public. The secrecy had become inseparable from the identity of the fraternity. Without it, the lodge was just another club. With it, it was forever burdened with suspicion. By the end of the 19th century, Masonry was deeply woven into both civic life and the imagination of conspiracy. Its halls hosted banquets and relief efforts after disasters. Its members filled roles of politicians, scientists, and artists. Yet every achievement seemed to confirm, for opponents, the existence of a hidden empire. The cult of the Masons had become less about what they did and more about what others believed they might be doing. In the 20th century, Freemasonry entered a paradox sharper than any it had known before. On the one hand, the fraternity was at the height of its institutional respectability. Lodges stood in the center of cities, with cornerstones laid in public ceremonies attended by governors, presidents, and crowds. Masons raised funds for hospitals, organized blood drives, and provided scholarships. The rituals, though still guarded, were widely published in exposés, and most of the world knew at least the outline of the degrees. To belong to the lodge was often to belong to the town's establishment. The mayor, the judge, the shopkeeper, all meeting in the same panelled hall. Yet at the same moment, the image of Masonry as a shadowy cabal hardened into modern myth. The rise of mass propaganda, the explosion of printed media, and later, the reach of radio and film spread stories faster than ever. Every secrecy could be magnified. Every coincidence turned into proof of a plot. It was no longer enough to accuse Masons of gathering behind closed doors. Now they were said to be orchestrating world events. The Great War and its aftermath gave fertile ground to these suspicions. In France, where the lodges had long supported republican and anti-clerical causes, the fraternity was accused by monarchists and Catholic groups of undermining tradition. In Italy, the conflict between church and Masonry became entangled with the rise of fascism. Mussolini first courted, then persecuted Masons, claiming they were agents of international liberalism conspiring against his state. In Spain, the accusations were harsher still. Francisco Franco declared Masonry one of his regime's greatest enemies, blaming it for the Republic and for every assault on his Catholic nationalist vision. Laws were passed criminalizing membership, and hundreds were imprisoned or executed as Masons, whether or not they had ever set foot in a lodge. Germany provided perhaps the darkest chapter. The Nazis wove Freemasonry into their conspiracy theories about Jewish control. Pamphlets and films portrayed lodges as secret fronts for global manipulation. The The square and compass appeared alongside the Star of David in grotesque propaganda posters. Thousands of Masons were arrested. Many were sent to concentration camps, where they were identified by blue triangles sewn onto their uniforms. To the SS, Masonry was not just a club, but an imagined pillar of the international order they sought to destroy. The irony was bitter. A fraternity that had prided itself on brotherhood across borders was persecuted as the embodiment of a sinister internationalism. In the United States, the fraternity thrived in numbers even as suspicions lingered. The Morgan affair of the 1820s had long since passed, but echoes remained in populist distrust. During the early 20th century, membership swelled. By the 1950s, millions of Americans attended lodge meetings. Presidents from Truman to Ford wore the apron and invoked Masonic values in public. Cornerstones of government buildings and war memorials were laid with Masonic ceremony. Yet even amid this respectability, whispers grew. Fundamentalist preachers denounced Masonry as a rival religion, accusing it of binding men with unchristian oaths. Conspiracy tracts painted it as the hidden engine behind banking, communism, capitalism, whatever threat the author most feared. The Cold War sharpened the paradox further. In the East, communist regimes banned Masonry outright, declaring it a bourgeois conspiracy. Lodges were shuttered, members forced underground. In the West, Masonry survived, but was often accused of playing a double game. When John F. Kennedy was elected president, some conspiracy theorists muttered about a Masonic plot to install Catholicism. Others accused him of resisting Masonic influence. The fact that both charges contradicted each other only proved to the suspicious that Masonry was everywhere. Meanwhile, the rituals themselves changed little. Men still passed through degrees that dramatized the building of Solomon's Temple. They still carried the working tools of Masons as moral allegories. They still swore oaths to secrecy, even though any curious reader could buy a printed exposure with the same words. What mattered was not that the words were unknown, but that they were spoken within the walls of the lodge, in the presence of brothers. Secrecy had become less a barrier to outsiders than a bond for insiders. The mystery was not what the Masons did, but why they did it. By the late 20th century, the fraternity was in decline in numbers, but flourishing in myth. Membership dropped as younger generations turned away from clubs and rituals. Lodges closed or merged. Once grand halls were sold or fell into disrepair. Yet in popular culture, Masonry was more visible than ever. Novels and films used it as shorthand for conspiracy. The idea of a hidden network pulling strings from the shadows fascinated audiences. From pulp thrillers to Hollywood blockbusters, the image of hooded men around a checkerboard floor became a trope. It mattered little that actual lodge meetings consisted of business minutes and pancake breakfasts. The myth was larger than the reality. The internet supercharged this process. On forums and websites, Masonry became linked with every possible conspiracy: the assassination of Kennedy, the attacks of September 11th, the supposed march toward a new world order. Symbols on dollar bills or in architecture were presented as proof of secret control. The eye in the pyramid, originally designed for the Great Seal of the United States by non-Masons, became in rumor the mark of Masonic dominion. The fraternity's own attempts to present itself openly, websites, museum exhibits, charity campaigns, did little to dampen the fascination. To many, the very fact that Masons said they had nothing to hide was taken as evidence that they had everything to hide. And yet, amid persecution and myth, the fraternity endured. It continued to initiate men, to collect dues, to fund scholarships, to maintain libraries of ritual and history. It weathered dictatorships and revolutions, accusations and caricatures. Its secrecy proved oddly resilient, not because its contents were unknown, but because the experience of secrecy itself had meaning. To whisper a password, to pass a grip, to hear a story told only within four walls. These acts gave members a sense of belonging that could not be replicated by exposure. The world outside turned those gestures into conspiracy. The men inside treated them as tradition. Why did Masonry become so entangled with suspicion? The answer lies in the very things that made it attractive. It crossed borders, uniting men of different nations and confessions at a time when politics demanded division. It taught allegories of equality and fraternity in societies built on hierarchy. It insisted on private loyalty in a world obsessed with public conformity. Each of these virtues looked, from the outside, like subversion. And when history convulsed, when revolutions flared, when dictatorships sought enemies, when fear demanded a target, the fraternity was ready-made as a villain. The cult of the Masons was never entirely self-made. It began with builders who guarded their craft, expanded with gentlemen who prized ritual, grew with Enlightenment thinkers who saw in it a symbol of universal brotherhood. But its mysteries multiplied most of all in the minds of those who could not enter. Outsiders built the legend, filling closed doors with imagined plots. That legend proved indestructible. Even as membership shrank, the myth remained global. By the dawn of the 21st century, Masonry had become both ordinary and extraordinary. A club of aging men in aprons who raised money for hospitals, and at the same time the centerpiece of global theories about hidden rulers. The two images live side by side, each feeding the other. The fraternity's secrecy created the suspicion, and suspicion in turn gave secrecy its allure. The cycle, begun in the lodges of medieval Masons who whispered passwords to protect their wages, continues in the digital age, where millions debate the meaning of symbols without ever setting foot in a lodge. This is why the story of the Masons is not only the history of a fraternity, but also the history of imagination. They built cathedrals of stone, then cathedrals of ritual, and finally cathedrals of rumor. They became a cult not because of what they hid, but because the world outside needed them to be hidden. And so the square and compasses, traced once on a dusty floor to guide a mason's hand, became signs of conspiracy carved into the memory of modernity itself. By the time the 20th century closed, Freemasonry had become as much a creature of rumor as of ritual. Newspapers, pulp novels, and finally the internet treated the fraternity less as a brotherhood of aging men in aprons and more as a cipher for every hidden hand behind world events. Yet the suspicion did not rest on Masonry alone. Another ghost, long dead in reality but vivid in imagination, had attached itself to the square and compass, the Illuminati. The Order of the Illuminati was born not in cathedral lodges, but in a Bavarian university town in 1776. Its founder, Adam Weishaupt, a professor of law with reformist zeal, designed it not as a craft guild, but as a disciplined network devoted to reason and liberty. Where Masons performed allegories of ancient builders, the Illuminati issued programs of social change. Where Masons insisted on political neutrality, the Illuminati pursued politics as their central mission. In practice, the order was small, scattered, and short-lived. Within a decade, it had been suppressed by edict and its leaders driven into exile. But myth does not obey police decrees. In the decades that followed, pamphleteers and polemicists linked the Illuminati with Freemasonry until the two names blurred. The French Revolution was said to be their joint work, Jacobins the visible tip of a secret brotherhood. Conservative writers like Augustin Barruel in France and John Robison in Britain described the revolution as the harvest of Masonic lodges and Illuminati cells. Their books sold briskly because they gave fear a villain, and in the public mind the distinction between the two fraternities collapsed. The reality was different. Masons laid cornerstones of courthouses and raised funds for orphanages. Illuminati never had time to lay a single stone. Masons multiplied degrees and rituals into elaborate dramas about fidelity and virtue. Illuminati designed a handful of ranks meant to train obedience to an inner circle. Masons embraced myth but shunned politics. Illuminati embraced politics but had little myth. Yet when revolution shook Europe, outsiders preferred to imagine a single vast conspiracy rather than scattered clubs. All secrecy looked alike. This confusion only deepened in the 19th century, when every liberal cause was accused of being Illuminized Masonry. For monarchs and priests, the two words became interchangeable. And because Freemasonry endured while the Illuminati had been stamped out, the lodges inherited the suspicion. The ghost of Weishaupt lived on inside their temples, a shadow they could never quite exorcise. In the 20th century, with mass media multiplying rumors, the hybrid myth became permanent. Anti-Masonic tracts in America spoke of the Illuminati as the secret rulers of the fraternity, an invisible inner circle guiding events. Conspiracy writers in Europe described wars, revolutions, even financial crashes as the work of lodges and Illuminati cells working hand in hand. By the time popular novels and films adopted the imagery, the distinction had disappeared altogether. The word Illuminati became shorthand for hidden rulers, and Masons, with their aprons and rituals, became the most obvious candidates. The irony is sharp. The Illuminati as an organization ceased to exist by 1790. Freemasonry, for all its secrecy, was never a revolutionary army. Yet in the imagination of outsiders, the two fused into one hydra-headed conspiracy. Today, when people speak of shadow governments, hidden elites, and world domination, they invoke both names together, the Masons and the Illuminati, twin pillars of suspicion. The fraternity did little to encourage this merger, but it could not prevent it. Once secrecy had become its costume, it could not shed it. Once oaths and symbols had been linked to revolution, they could not be untangled. What began as a guild of builders and a professor's experiment in reform became, in myth, the architects of history itself.